If you walk through Paris today, it is a city of light. Wide boulevards, cafes, tourists taking photos. It is hard to imagine that beneath those cobblestones lies a different city. A city of blood, paranoia, and industrial-scale murder. We like to think of the French Revolution as a political event, a story of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But it was also an engineering project with a much darker side. Before 1792, execution was a messy business. Nobles were beheaded with swords, which often took 3 or 4 swings. Commoners were hanged, broken on the wheel, or drawn and quartered. It was brutal, inefficient, and unequal. Enter Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine. He wasn't a monster, he was a humanitarian. He argued that if the state must kill, it should do so without cruelty. He proposed a machine that would decapitate in the twinkling of an eye. They called it the Louison, then the Louisette, and finally the Guillotine. It was a marvel of efficiency. A heavy, oblique blade guided by grooves, powered by gravity. It didn't miss. It didn't get tired. It didn't hesitate. Historical accounts from the era describe a city that initially viewed the machine with curiosity. It was a novelty, a symbol of the new, rational age. No one yet realized that they hadn't just built an execution device. They had built a factory. How do you feed a machine that never gets full? You need a steady supply of raw material. In 1793, the revolution turned inward. The law of suspects was passed. Suddenly, it wasn't just aristocrats who were in danger. You could be arrested for what you said, for who you knew, or simply for not being enthusiastic enough about the revolution. Historical accounts of the time describe a city where every man was a spy upon his neighbor. Paris became a panopticon. The city was divided into 48 sections, each with its own surveillance committee. Concierges became informants. A misplaced word at the bakery could lead to a midnight knock on the door. The prisons, la force, the conciergerie, filled to bursting. The trials became theatre. There were no defense lawyers, no witnesses, just the accusation and the verdict. Every afternoon, the carts, the tumbrils, would make their slow journey from the prisons to the scaffold. It became a daily ritual. The victims were paraded through the streets like cattle on their way to the slaughterhouse. The psychological terror of that journey was often worse than the end itself. You were stripped of your dignity long before you lost your life. If you find this unexplored side of history compelling, please like and subscribe to our channel for more episodes of PastEdge. This is where the psychology of industrialization takes over. When execution is slow and difficult, you can only kill a few people a day. When it takes less than a minute, the only limit is logistics. During the height of the Terror, the Great Terror of 1794, the pace accelerated furiously. They moved the guillotine to the Barrière du Trône to handle the volume. But the true horror wasn't just the number of dead. It was who they were. We imagine the guillotine taking the heads of arrogant dukes and princes, although it is far from the truth that all executed aristocrats were arrogant or even high-ranking. But the machine was not picky. It consumed everyone. Records show that the youngest victim was just 14 years old. The oldest was over 90. They executed senile women who didn't understand where they were. They executed nuns, like the Carmelites of Compiègne, who went to their deaths singing hymns. When the blade in the provinces proved too slow for the Republic's zealots, the terror escalated to a new level: mass execution. This crisis was worst in Nantes, where Jean-Baptiste Carrier, the deputy sent by the Convention, faced prisons overflowing with thousands of counter-revolutionaries, priests, women and children captured during the brutal conflict in the Vendée. Carrier declared his solution was to employ the river Loire as a liquid grave. Between November 1793 and February 1794, the terror escalated to what Carrier cynically termed the vertical deportation. The method was horrifying. Prisoners were stripped, bound, often a man and a woman tied together in the perverse republican marriage, and loaded onto specially adapted flat-bottomed barges known as gabets. These boats were equipped with concealed trapdoors or holes bored into the hull. Once the boats reached the middle of the river, the hatches were opened, sinking the victims en masse. The sheer horror turned the mighty Loire into a poisoned, perpetual cemetery. Accounts from local inhabitants describe a river choked with floating, putrefying corpses, rendering the water undrinkable and creating a pestilential stench that hung over the entire region for months. The psychological terror inflicted on the surrounding villages was absent. The river, once a source of life, became a symbol of industrial, revolutionary murder. The victims were overwhelmingly women, children, and priests. Carrier called it the bathtub of the Republic. The accounts of the time record how these methods were born of an inhuman desperation for speed. A consistent and systematic target of the terror was the Church. The revolution sought not just to control the clergy, but to eradicate the faith itself. Priests and nuns who refused to swear allegiance to the new secular republic were branded as traitors and faced unimaginable cruelty. In some regional massacres, such as the Noyades, boats loaded with condemned priests were reportedly fired upon with cannons to ensure their destruction. A large and consistent portion of the victims were these innocent clergy, simply targeted for their vows and beliefs. Furthermore, the victims included huge numbers of peasants and farmers who dared to resist the revolution's harsh levies, military conscription, and the persecution of their local church. The brutal wars in the Vendée region demonstrated that the machine of virtue was willing to execute thousands of its own rural citizens for opposing its agenda. Beyond the horrific public spectacle, the terror brought a slow, grinding misery to the common people the revolution claimed to serve. Economic collapse was immediate. The national currency, the assignat, became virtually worthless due to hyperinflation. As financiers protected themselves, the burden fell hardest on the poorest, erasing the meager savings they possessed. Widespread scarcity emerged not just from failed harvests, but from social breakdown. Goods were hoarded by sellers hoping for higher prices, leading to mob attacks and looting of over 200 stores in Paris for essentials like bread, coffee, and sugar. In a desperate attempt to control the chaos, the government instituted the maximum, capping the prices of necessary commodities. But this revolutionary zeal only amplified the misery. Commodities simply disappeared from markets, as farmers refused to bring their produce to the cities. For those in the provinces, this combination of ideological fanaticism, brutal leadership, and economic devastation turned hope into regret. Vast numbers, particularly in regions like the Vendée, took up arms in bitter counter-revolutionary insurrections, choosing outright civil war against the Republic over the puritanical, starving new regime. The price of liberty and equality was an entire society fractured by chaos, hunger, and mass murder. The terror was not always cold efficiency. It also provided a cover for deep-seated sadism and sexual perversion. In the provincial prisons and among the sans-culotte gangs, victims were often young women and girls subjected to appalling abuse, torture, and sexual degradation before their deaths. The official justification was political, but the reality, as evidenced in private journals and later trials of terror agents, was a sanctioned campaign of barbarity. The revolution claimed to be purging vice, but in reality it often unleashed it, allowing its functionaries to indulge in the worst aspects of human nature under the banner of liberty and equality. The brutality became mundane. Sick prisoners were dragged from their hospital beds to the scaffold. Mothers were executed alongside their daughters. Charles-Henri Sanson, the High Executioner, complained that the sheer volume of blood was becoming a health hazard. It soaked into the ground of the square. The soil turned putrid. They had to dig special channels to drain the blood away. The machine of virtue had created a swamp of gore in the center of the enlightened capital. The revolution, in its desire to appear rational and modern, presented the guillotine as a crowning achievement of humanism. A swift, clean death for all, regardless of rank. But this veneer of enlightened execution hid a deeper, more primitive cruelty. The same tribunals that sent victims to the national razor often delivered them straight into the hands of the Parisian mob. The September massacres of 1792 were a horrifying prelude, where prisoners were hauled before summary courts and then butchered by armed crowds in the streets. This was not the quick, detached death of the machine. This was savage, hands-on, personalized violence. A mob tearing victims apart in a drunken, bloodthirsty fury. Their mutilated remains then proudly paraded through the city. There is a famous saying from the era: "The revolution, like Saturn, devours its own children." And eventually, the machine turned on its masters. Evil, by its nature, is self-consuming. Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the terror, the incorruptible, finally went too far. He threatened the convention itself. In an instant, the fear that had paralyzed them turned into desperate aggression. They realized that to survive, the machine had to be fed one last great meal. On the 10th of Thermidor, the system ate itself. Robespierre was arrested. The next day, he was loaded into the same cart he had sent thousands of others in: friends, enemies, innocents. As he was strapped onto the plank, the executioner tore the bandage from his shattered jaw. He let out a final, agonizing scream that was silenced only by the falling blade. The terror ended not with a whimper, but with the death of the man who had industrialized it. The fever broke as quickly as it had started. The prisons were opened, but the stain remained. The revolution started with high ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, but it ended in the gutters of the Place de la Révolution. It proved that a society that abandons basic humanity for the sake of efficiency and political purity becomes a monster. Please remember to like and subscribe to our channel if you want to explore more episodes about the unexplored side of history. The guillotine wasn't just a weapon, it was a mirror. It showed us how quickly civilization's veneer can crack, how easily neighbors can turn into spies. Between 1793 and 1794, over 17,000 people were officially guillotined. But the terror's victims, including those from the Noyades de Nantes and other mass massacres, number in the tens of thousands. When we factor in the related conflicts, the total human cost of the revolution ranges from over 1 million to nearly 1.4 million killed. This horrifying toll shows how the pursuit of a perfect society, when combined with industrial efficiency, can create a perfect hell. But at what point does the pursuit of an ideal corrupt and transform into its opposite? Or was it never about the ideal at all, but rather a pretext for the unleashing of the darkest sides of human nature? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.